Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Jeff Holtzman. He's the CEO of IIRM. We're going to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on commercial real estate. Jeff, it's great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us on Trade Talks. And I can imagine that the impact is real in the commercial real estate market.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jill. It's always good to be back. Yeah, without a doubt, the impact has been tremendous across all aspects of commercial real estate. And, you know, when people talk about commercial real estate, they think we're only talking about office space or outdoor malls, but we're also talking a lot about residential multifamily assets that are commercial grade and managed by a company. So this affects everybody across the country.
Yeah, that's a great point. And if we take a look at our first slide here, this goes into the CARES Act and how that relates, I would imagine, more to the residential side.
Yes. So I think this is, by the way, to be fair to the government, and again, without getting political, what the government has done with the CARES Act is tremendous. And the impact that it had is really second to none, because a lot of these companies, and you have to consider that every single one of these multifamily entities for residential where people actually live is a single entity, right? It's a single LLC. So even if the developer, the owner, the sponsor is actually doing well financially, that doesn't mean that a single asset can't absolutely get crushed under the weight of this coronavirus impact, with a lot of people losing their jobs. So when we think about multifamily residential spaces, especially the Class B and Class C, where a lot of people across the country may have been impacted, and again, this has never happened to us, where everybody across the country is impacted at the same time, right? This is not localized to just one market. You could be living in Washington State, you could be living in South Florida. Everybody is impacted by this thing. So what the government has done is truly a bailout. The Small Business Administration, the SBA, introduced two very important vehicles, if you will. One is the PPL, or the Paycheck Protection Loan, also called the Paycheck Protection Program Loan, and the EIDL, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. Now, those two vehicles have been around, so maybe some of your viewers already know and have heard about these plans, but they had nowhere near the amount of funding that was required in order to actually assist so many businesses across the country. So what the CARES Act really did is it funded, the federal government funded those programs that in turn, this is a phenomenal exercise in trickle-down economics, because once the government does that and the funding is available, other entities like us can then apply, and then the funds become available literally within days. So without a doubt, and again, without going political, because we'll all be paying for this debt for a very long time, without a doubt, what the government did absolutely helped keep many, many businesses afloat.
And if we take a look at the next slide here, there are a number of additional policy responses that the government put in place as well.
Yes, and of course, these are debatable. And you know, whenever the government puts these kind of provisions in place quickly, that means that the legislator did not have an adequate amount of time to debate it, all the pros and cons. There's usually what we call a notice of proposed rulemaking, which gives the industry and trade groups an opportunity to weigh in. This was all done very fast, and there's a lot of gray areas, and that's why we already know that there's going to be some litigation about, whether it was planned correctly, whether it was used or abused. One example I think all of your viewers probably read about in the paper is Ruth Chris, the steakhouse chain. Another good example is the LA Lakers. These are businesses. They have employees. They were correct in their legal proceedings when they applied for the Paycheck Protection Program. And they were, in fact, awarded millions of dollars. But that is not what the legislator intended. And there's a small article, you got to read the fine print when it comes to the SBA programs. There's a small, often overlooked article in those applications that say you must have a real, demonstrable COVID-19 hardship. So this is not the government giving everybody that meets the criteria a blank check and says, don't worry about it, we'll cover your payroll for the next 90 days. This is the government saying, hey, you got to give me a statement here that you were really harmed by this crisis. And I think what happened with a lot of these entities, including the ones that we mentioned, the LA Lakers is a big brand, everybody kind of relates, they thought or they anticipated being hurt. And by the way, they may, in fact, demonstrate hardship down the line. But they were very quick to apply for the loan, and then all the pushback they got in the media, which is, in my opinion, justifiable, was because they didn't really meet the hardship barrier, where commercial real estate properties that are already seeing 20 and 30% delinquency And again, this is not a result of people choosing not to pay the rent, although that also happens in submarkets. These are people that genuinely lost their jobs. So what we did at IIRM we oversee literally hundreds of real estate assets ranging from multifamily to hospitality to malls to office buildings, you name it, we got it. But what we've done with some of our the Federal Housing Financial Authority, like Fannie and Freddie, that they back our multifamily projects, what we've done with those is we've applied for a forbearance. And this is really important to understand. Basically, the government says, hey, you don't have to give me your mortgage payment for the next 3 months because we understand there's a difficulty in the market. But in return, the government says, you cannot evict anybody because we don't want to throw anybody out on the street in the middle of a health crisis. And by the way, in all fairness, IIRM would never have done that in the first place, but that is a great tool that the government deployed, stepping into a hard situation and saying, hey, if you have to pay us, the federal government, in order, and you can't do that, why don't you just not pay us for 90 days and we'll talk about it later? Now, the government didn't forego those payments, they forbore those payments. So we still have to make them, but we got 12 months to catch up. And in return, we don't have to kick anybody out in the street if they can't afford to make rent payments during a health crisis.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction to make. Thank you for clarifying that. And to wrap up here, let's talk about the current state of commercial real estate, what you're seeing within the industry, and quickly review IIRM portfolio.
Perfect, happy to do so. So like I said, IIRM oversees one of the largest crowd-funded real estate portfolios in the world. We kind of maneuvered into that position about a year and a half ago when we essentially were hired by Realty Shares, a very large investor in commercial real estate that decided to shut down, and they hired us to manage and oversee their entire portfolio. So overnight, we inherited hundreds of real estate assets worth billions of dollars with thousands and thousands of mostly American individual investors. So we have an unbelievable insight into the state of commercial real estate across the country. And it varies greatly. And this is probably a very important takeaway for your viewers to take. Not everybody is going to be affected exactly the same. If you were in a Class A property in an area where demand remained substantially high, you may not be even impacted at all. If you're in a preferred position or a common equity position for a long-term investment, assuming that the market would recover, there's a very good chance that your investment is solid. You might sell it down the road a couple of years from now for a significant amount of profit. Absolutely. So not everybody's affected the same way. Where we're seeing probably the most amount of difficulty is in the lower grade multifamilies, Class B and Class C. And when we say Class B and Class C, for those viewers of yours who are not intimately familiar with commercial real estate, that usually correlates to levels of income. So there's no one numeral definition for Class B and Class C. It usually means that where the lower end, hardworking, blue-collar population tends to reside. That's usually the industry definition. Another segment we're seeing hard hit, student housing. You know that a lot of campuses are closed. One of the first things students do is they get the heck out of there. They go home. Are they coming back? Are all colleges opening? We don't really know yet. And we live in an amazing country, but it's comprised of 50 different states, and every state has its own rules. And what you have with student housing is a lot of uncertainty. And what's one thing you don't do when there's a lot of uncertainty? You don't sign long-term rent agreements. So we'll figure it out when things open. And probably the hardest hit sector in IIRM's portfolio is hospitality. We have a few dozen hotels across the country, ranging from very high end to relatively low end, everywhere from Florida through Oklahoma, Ohio, and Washington State. So we have tremendous visibility into the hospitality sector. Everybody is hit and hit hard. Most of our hotels, I would say in the last month, were single-digit occupancy. That is not sustainable. That is very, very bad news. In some cases, by law, they cannot open, they cannot operate. We have seen, and this is worth noting, some very smart operators who pivoted. And so one example is they turned the hospital into a Corona hospital, right? Where the local hospital, the hotel turned into a Corona hotel. So if a local hospital is overwhelmed, the hotel said, hey, why don't you send those patients to us? We'll keep them in the rooms and we'll provide basic services. Another thing that I thought was sheer genius that I saw do in the New York Metro is one of our hotels actually pivoted and worked with the hospital to provide short-term rest for the hardworking medical staff. So instead of having a medical professional, a nurse, a doctor, having to go all the way back to their house, which could be an hour or 2 hours worth of commutes, they said, hey, we got you a hotel room down the block. Why don't you go get a couple hours of rest and come back do another shift? Which is an amazing, it's one of those win-win solutions where everybody's helped. Unfortunately, that's not everybody. So we did see a lot of hotels that are going to suffer through this crisis.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate the insight.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.